Hello and welcome to this AP4D webinar on turbulence in diplomacy and trade. What does it mean for Australia? You certainly don't need me to tell you that this is a turbulent time. I'm Melissa Conley-Tyler. I'm the Executive Director of AP4D, the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. I'm joining you today from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra and pay my respects to elders past and present. Also, warmly welcome any Indigenous people who are joining us today. We are delighted that we have over 200 people who have registered to either join us live or to watch afterwards at their convenience. If you are joining us live, we do have a live caption service, so please click the show captions icon to make that available. We also, if you're joining us live, will be having our chat enabled. We're not having a formal question and answer session. We are giving you a very quick, very jam-packed program. But what we hope you'll do is use the chat to share your impressions, both with each other and with the panelists who will be able to reply to you in chat if there's anything that you ask them they want to see. So what we're going to do today is we'll first of all have an overview of current disruptions in diplomacy and trade from Advisory Group member and Asia Society's Richard Maude. We then have an extraordinary panel who are going to look at the ramifications across economics, across Pacific, Southeast Asia, multilateralism, Indian Ocean. And we're delighted to be joined by experts from the US Study Centre, the Australia-India Institute, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ANU, and the Pacific Security College, and I'll introduce them all properly later. But to kick us off on this time of turbulence and what does it look like, I'm delighted to invite Richard Maude to give his opening. Now, he's travelling at the moment, so he had to record a little bit ahead of time. And as we know with the world we're in at the moment, after 5 minutes, things can change. So I think you get a great idea of what we're looking at the time he recorded for us. So over to Richard to scene set for us today.
Well, the past couple of months have been truly something, haven't they? But then when you think about it, the past couple of years have seen the most extraordinary amount of change, and it's been difficult to sum it all up, let alone know where it's going and what to do about it. So I feel a little inadequate to the task that I've been given today, which is to do a very quick scene setter for the discussion that will follow. I feel that this is definitely an era in which we need to tap the collective wisdom of the crowd. So I really do welcome this AP4D seminar and the discussion that follow. Where to begin? I'm going to argue that the contours of a new transformational era are now becoming much clearer. I use the word transformational here cautiously but deliberately. Most foreign policy specialists are always cautious about using such grand labels, and it's certainly true that we've been talking for a very long time now about a lot of change and uncertainty in the international system, and we know that we've been sliding towards a very different kind of world order to the one we enjoyed for much of the post-war period without really knowing where things were going to end up. But I think now we have a clearer idea. True, we still can't be sure about the final destination. There is an awful lot yet to play out before we reach some kind of settling point, if we do at any point in the coming years. But I think recent events have clarified some trends that we could be more confident now about them. So I'll give you 6 quickly that hopefully will substantiate this idea of a transformational era. First, to begin, of course, where everyone's focus is at the moment on America, and we really, I think, do see now a definitive end to the era of Pax Americana and the introduction of an era in which America is redefining its relationship with the rest of the world. Of course, President Trump doesn't want to prop up global order. He certainly doesn't want to prop up a liberal order, and Trump and those around him believe that the grand strategy of much of America's post-war period has simply sapped America's strength. He views allies and partners as a drag on America for the most part, and he certainly doesn't believe in free trade or global institutions. Of course, Trump, it's right to say that Trump is not the only person that will shape American foreign policy, and even though he clearly wants to be president forever, he's almost certainly not going to be. So how much is this an enduring change? Well, I think it's really important to remember that successive Democratic administrations have themselves sought to wind back America's global commitments. They wanted allies to do more. Biden's team talked about a foreign policy for the middle classes that had a high degree of economic nationalism embedded in it. And Americans themselves certainly don't no longer want to pay any price or bear any burden. We will see some elements of continuity, and we may be able to work with those, including in terms of a military balance of power and deterrence of China. But we're going to get a lot of contradictory and chaotic decision-making under Trump. And in any event, I think if you're looking for the signals in the noise, a favourite saying around Canberra, then really the true signal through all the noise is an America that is winding back what was always a very broad definition of American national interest and is redefining its relations with the world. Secondly, I think it's absolutely clear we're entering a totally different era of trade relations. America is a big part of that, but it's not just about Trump and his personal passion on tariffs. Americans more broadly have come to see globalization as a bad idea, and American political parties are now more interested in jobs and in communities and industries and making things in America. And of course, national security will continue to drive an element of economic nationalism and self-reliance as well. And this is not just an American story. We've seen in the past couple of years trade barriers begin to rise across the world. Often that's a result of competition from China. So the really deep story here, I think, is one of global trade imbalances. You've got a collection of deficit countries and a collection of surplus countries, and those countries with very large trade deficits are no longer willing to put up with the consequences of that. China largely sits at the center of that story because it's the manufacturing floor of the world. And now, of course, Xi Jinping is doubling down on trying to export China's way out of economic malaise, and that's simply going to add to protectionism and economic nationalism and tensions between China and the rest of the world. I think the third trend is the emergence or more prominence of other poles of power in the world and possibly the return of spheres of influence. And I think you can make that argument even accepting that America will be the biggest, strongest power in the world, continue to be so for some time. So China, of course, is the center of this story with its aspirations to dominate Asia and to be a global peer of the United States globally. But India, countries like India are playing a more independent role, the European Union, if it can get its act together, global South countries like Brazil, and even Russia, even though it doesn't deserve to be at the top table, is definitely viewed by the Trump administration as a key pole in what they themselves say is a more multipolar world. So this is an era of much more fluid relationships, partnerships, and diverse alliances across the globe. In the interest of time, let me just mention three more other trends very quickly that try and substantiate this idea of a transformational era. One is obviously an era in which power rather than rules will be more determinative of outcomes. Secondly, an era in which we can no longer hope to contain global warming to under 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So within a few years, we'll test that proposition that 1.5 degrees is an important marker, because beyond that, there is a higher risk of much more significant climatic change. And then lastly, an era, for better or worse, or better and worse, of transformational technological change. So that's a lot for any country to deal with. What to do about it? Well, That's the subject of many discussions, including this one, and will be a preoccupation of any new government. We can recognise that as a country, we're as well placed as any to deal with the current era. A lot of good work's being done in our foreign policy. We have a strategy for a more lethal Australian Defence Force with more deterrent power, even if it's an underfunded strategy, but the direction is there. So the question is it all enough? And I do think in this transformational era, we have to ask ourselves that, taken as a whole, are our foreign and defence policies, a grand strategy, if you like, for this new era adequate? We should ask ourselves if we're talking to the Australian public in the right way so that they can understand the era. We should ask ourselves if we are talking inside government in the right way. That is, are we using vocabulary and concepts that are fit for this new era, or trying to cling to the wreckage of the past? And then lastly, we should look at our domestic policies, as hard as they are to shape and influence, that are the source of Australia's strength and resilience. So that's our economic settings. They go to the state of the national accounts, the cohesion of our society, the resilience and strength of our institutions, our preparedness for crisis or conflict. Is all of that fit for purpose? I think the answer, at least in part, will have to be no. So the question is within the constraints of politics and time and money and the limits of a middle power, what can we do? And I suppose, to conclude where I began, the answers to those questions cannot possibly lie in any one single individual or even a small group of individuals. So now is the time to draw on the collective expertise across the Australian system to contest analysis and to test ideas, policy ideas, and to be as creative as we can. So I hope this seminar plays a part in that discussion, and I'll leave my remarks there and wish you all the best for the rest of the webinar.
Well, huge thanks to Richard for recording that for us. I think you would expect nothing less in terms of analysis from a former Director General of Office of National Assessments. I'm really impressed, though, at how much Richard has asked us to think to the future, to new paradigms. I note behind him on screen, you could see world of pain, but instead of focusing just on the world of pain, he's focused on a transformational era and what we can do in this era. And I particularly love the idea that it's not just one individual or group, it's a collective effort. That is very much what AP4D was established to do, to bring together great thinkers across many different tools of statecraft to make sure that we're maximising our impact on the world. So I am delighted to have 5 of these wonderful experts with me today. And I've got some, I suppose, a very simple question to start with. I just want to know, what's the impact of the turbulence on the area? So I'm going to start off looking at economic security and trade relationships, something that we're very, very focused on at the moment. And I'm going to call on Hayley Channer, who's one of the directors at the US Study Centre at the University of Sydney. So Hayley, you're looking at this all the time. What is the impact that you're seeing?
Thanks, Melissa, and it's fantastic to be with you all. Yes, as you can imagine, working at the US Study Centre as its Director of Economic Security, I have a lot on my plate right now. And Richard said that we're in a transformational era. Every day I feel like there is a new development that I can't keep up with. And that also makes analysis hard, and it makes the so what hard, and it makes the so what should we do about it the hardest part. But part of this solution will be this conversation. So let me just get out a couple of key points, because I also want to hear from my other panel members. So it would be odd if I didn't talk about Trump and tariffs and what they mean for Australia. I don't often just talk about exactly what's happened in the news, because sometimes you can miss the bigger picture, miss the forest for the trees, as they say. But I actually think that Trump tariffs is a turning point in the relationship between Australia and the United States, really the United States and the world. And so I can actually extrapolate from that, what does that mean? My main takeaway in these opening comments is that countries are losing confidence in the United States and they will seek to de-risk from the United States. Trump is trying to use tariffs for contradictory purposes. He talks about using them for negotiation and leverage to get countries to address their trade deficits, or for foreign policy reasons like immigration or fentanyl. He also talks about tariffs for raising domestic revenue, getting taxpayers to pay these tariffs to the US government and fixing the US debt crisis. And he also talks about them for national security and bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Now, any one of those things could be true, but they can't all be true at once. You can't both leverage tariffs to get countries to fix their trade deficits as well as raise domestic revenue. Either you start trade back up on a more even playing field, or you bring manufacturing back. And even bringing manufacturing back doesn't make a whole lot of sense because unemployment in the United States is historically low. So it's uncertain where these people would come from. It's also uncertain whether people actually want to go back into those manufacturing jobs. The chaos of the Trump administration, embodied in the tariff changes, is so damaging that it's undermining confidence in the US globally. The policy changes themselves aren't crippling. It's the speed of the policy changes. Sometimes they're happening weekly, other times daily, other times I wake up and I check my phone and there's a different policy from what there was the night before. Examples of this are this morning when President Trump decided to put a pause on his reciprocal tariffs for the next 90 days. And previous to that, it was when he announced the doubling of tariffs on Canada, and then he changed his mind. Now, what this means is that people can't keep up with the changes and businesses won't invest, or more likely they'll invest elsewhere. What could it look like for countries to de-risk from the United States? Well, that probably means they're going to invest more in other supply chains, including in places like Southeast Asia, South America, and elsewhere. This goes for Australia as well. Just to look at our domestic situation, the polls show a Labor government will return in May this year, and that means a continuation of our current climate and energy policies. And it also means that Australia will continue to very much look at Southeast Asia and the Pacific as key partners and allies. I've got a list of countries that I think Australia should be investing much more deeply in across a whole spectrum, not just economics, but in defense and diplomacy. They are in no particular order: Japan, India, South Korea, the United Kingdom, Vietnam, Canada, Indonesia, the Philippines, France, Germany, and the Pacific. There's a smorgasbord of countries there. We've always gravitated to the United States because they were the most powerful and in some ways the easiest to deal with. Now I think we need to invest much more deeply in all of these other relationships because we are in a multipolar world. So I'll leave my comments there and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Thank you. That said it very well. And you may see we're getting questions coming in around things like the readiness and fit for the business community from Meriden Varrell, stock markets from Ian Oxenford. So please keep your comments coming in, everybody. So I'm now going to turn to the multilateral system, which I think is another area we might say is a bit of a casualty of this turbulence. So to speak to us, we've got Emeritus Professor of Diplomacy, Bill Maley, who was the founding director of the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at ANU. So Bill, do you have any other positive thoughts about how this turbulence is affecting multilateralism? And if you don't, just tell us what you think.
No, I'm not particularly positive about where we're heading at the moment. But I'd like to say at the outset that when we talk about multilateralism, we need to appreciate that it comes in different shapes and sizes, and that it's not just one single system, but a confluence of different mechanisms for interaction that can be affected to different degrees by the kind of buffetings that we've witnessed in the international system in recent times. You can have minilateralism, plurilateralism, organizational-based multilateralism, issue-based multilateralism, universal organizations, regional organizations. So there are plenty of different environments that can be affected by the circumstances that we confront. But what we do see in multilateralism is a set of underpinnings that really do need to be there if one's going to be able to use multilateral institutions or engagements in a fruitful sense. The first is simply interest. There needs to be a desire or commitment to interact, and that goes beyond simply shared values. They won't necessarily drive high-level interaction. The difficulty that we are facing at the moment is that we've, for many years, premised our approach to interest underpinning multilateralism on the view that these tend to be permanent, enduring, going right back to the kind of notions that Viscount Palmerston put forward in the 19th century. But one of the lessons that has come from the Trump era is that the interests of the United States are what the incumbent president defines those interests to be. And if you have a system which begins to put eccentric people into the White House, then attempts to defend one's mechanisms of engagement on the basis that we can be certain what the interests of the different participants will be tend to unravel. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. Another underpinning for a multilateral system is a set of rules or norms that govern the way in which state actors will interact with each other. If you actually don't have a framework of norms or rules to govern the behaviours of the participants, then multilateral engagement becomes very difficult. And the analogy that stands up historically at the moment is what happened in the 1930s, particularly to the League of Nations. It's easily forgotten that the League of Nations, derided as it is now by historians, had quite a lot of achievements in the 1920s, which was an era of optimism. But when different kinds of leaders came on the scene in Europe from really 1933 onwards, the system proved to be incapable of surviving the stresses that those new rulers imposed, simply because of the indifference that those rulers displayed towards the rules of the system. And thus one saw not only in Europe with Germany and Italy, but also in the Far East with Japan, activities being pursued which were really inconsistent with the notion of multilateral institutions effectively shaping the way in which power was exercised. And that's a second underpinning that's also in danger at the moment. And the third, which in a way flows from these, is trust. And when one talks about trust here, one isn't talking about whether people are nice individuals, but really the degree of predictability that can be associated with people. David Niven once said of Errol Flynn that you could always trust Errol, you could trust him to let you down. And sometimes that is a sufficient form of predictability to govern one's interactions. But one of the things that we've witnessed just in the last 24 hours is the way in which just as the stock market went down in the United States, so did the Treasury bond market, despite the widespread expectation that people moving out of stocks would move into US Treasury bonds. When that happens, it's a marker of a more pervasive problem of distrust in an entire player. And when that happens, it becomes extremely difficult to manage multilateralism, or for that matter, manage alliances. An ally that you can't trust isn't really an ally at all. And that's the sense in which what we've seen very recently has really been corrosive of multilateralism. It may not affect every element of multilateral engagement because regional structures will continue to be active and possibly provide much more vibrant venues for interaction than we've seen up to this point. But as far as the United States is concerned, the problem is not just Trump. It's the problem of a system which has evolved to the point where someone like Trump and his associates could actually get to the top of the system. And there's no obvious cure for that on display at the moment.
Well, as Richard said, redefining its relations with the world, that affects trust, predictability, institutions. So we've looked, I suppose, so far at the global scene. I'd like to now focus in on the region, on Indo-Pacific. So I'm going to call on Joel Nilon, who's a senior fellow at the Pacific Security College and formerly was regionally part of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat looking at Pacific regionalism. So, Joel, what's the impact on the Pacific of what we're looking at, both at a diplomacy and at a trade side?
Thank you, Melissa, and again, a pleasure to join everyone here. I think one response is to say that I mean, yes, it is a transformative sort of era, as Richard was saying earlier, but in another way, it sort of just brings the future that the Pacific has sort of been eyeing off for some time now. I mean, again, as Richard explained, you know, there were and have been some signs that there's a likelihood of sort of economic nationalism globally, even in the first Trump presidency, and as part of that presidency, even signs of an erosion of the multilateral rules-based order as well. And I think if you were to look hard enough, you might see signals that even post-COVID, that there were likelihoods of decline in ODA globally, but also in the Pacific. And so I think some of the things that are happening just in the last few months probably accelerated a number of maybe trends that the Pacific, I think, has been wary of for some time now. And so in one way, it is a transformative sort of change that we're looking at, but in another way, it's probably an acceleration of a future that many sort of Pacific Outlook reports and you know forecasts probably have you know thought about for some time. I think the question of what the impacts on the Pacific might be or will be in relation to the most recent sort of turbulence. I think if you think of potential impacts of tariffs, I was just looking at some analysis from other colleagues across the ANU. Some countries like Fiji, where I'm currently based, will be seemingly hit harder by the reciprocal tariffs imposed by the US than other countries. But by and large, across the Pacific, it seems like the economic impact of the tariffs themselves will be less than the broader economic fallout that the Pacific might stand to lose from in terms of a more broader global recession that may eventuate. If other economies that the Pacific relies on are themselves hit, and our sort of, for instance, tourism economies are sort of hit, our dependency on imports of oil and food are also sort of impacted as well. But also, I guess the impacts of the withdrawal of the US sort of footprint and presence, particularly in a sort of development sense, will potentially sort of lead the Pacific to sort of consider other partners that it might want to engage with to fill the vacuum that the US may have sort of left behind. And I think the acceleration of trends, the instability and the withdrawal of the US, I think possibly gives the Pacific some options to think about in terms of going forward. I like Richard's sort of pointing towards the need for transformational efforts, and for myself in the Pacific, I really believe that the Pacific now, with the future brought forward in many ways, has to think about really binding together much more closely. The Pacic's benefited from Pacific regionalism, over the last 50 years under the guise of the Pacific Islands Forum. I think the Pacific now has to really think carefully and clearly about, taking a much more integrated form of regionalism, whether that is economically, whether that is in terms of, having a much more freer movement of people around the region and to places like Australia and New Zealand, whether that is in terms of security, integration and cooperation, whether that is thinking about having a far more integrated Pacific foreign policy in terms of the way that it interacts with its partners around the world. I think the turbulence and the instability of the current time has the potential to provide disunity amongst the Pacific Islands Forum member countries. And so, my sort of prescription would be for the Pacific to think carefully and clearly about, really accelerating a program of Pacific regional integration.
Mm-hmm.
I say that, with the caveat that a lot of Pacific Island countries guard their sovereignty jealously. And so it's something that they really have to think clearly and carefully about. But in this current time, I would really put that forward on the table. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, and that talks about the range of responses that these disruptions in development, in trade, might be having. I am going to come back to everyone and ask them what should Australia's response be, and I'm really looking forward to Joel's response on that. But I do want to go next to Southeast Asia. So we're delighted to have Dr. Fitriani, who's a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And I'm interested in how much, Fitri, that it's similar or differing in Southeast Asia. What's your sense of the impact across the board from what we're seeing, development, diplomacy, and trade?
Hi, Mel. Thanks for having me. Yes, we wake up one day with President Trump with big boy with his big chart, imposing tariff. Cambodia was hit largest with 49%. Following that, we have Laos as well. These two countries are close to China. Then we have Vietnam, 46%, and Myanmar, 44%. And then Thailand, Indonesia going. The luckiest country, which is not really lucky, imposed by the baseline 10% tariff is Singapore, just because Singapore has trade deficit with the US, as well as will be member of ASEAN, Timor-Leste. And this actually provide a wake-up call, at least to Singapore, that perceive itself as a country that's close to the US, and it brings surprise. Of course, the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nation, where the regional organization actually then convene a meeting 5th of April to actually respond it. How could we, group of countries, respond collectively with this tariff imposition? However, knowing that not all countries impose with the same amount of tariff, not all countries willing to join the discussion eagerly. Of course, there are countries that already reach out to the US to renegotiate, but then also, I think if it's not all, most of them are actually very sober and think that we need to look for other countries than the US to actually build, cooperation. If it's not all, at least not in strategic economic, but at least in economic and trade, because that what builds prosperity. And without prosperity and growth, there's a concern the region with the higher number of population, there would be internal struggle, and then it makes the countries that like relatively shaky in terms of democracy can fall out to more political fragility. And we don't want that, because it will then bring out the issue of transnational crime, as we see in Myanmar with cyber scam and the production of opioid, and then as well as the cyber scam actually already spread to several countries in Southeast Asia. And with this economic uncertainty, we need to actually take precaution of this. I know I'm not going to answer what Australia can do, because you'll ask that later. But the Southeast Asian country, they actually renegotiate with the US. How can they do better, or perhaps ask for the imposition for tariff to be delayed. Meanwhile, Indonesia actually say, like, maybe we just open for other country to why do we impose tariff? Let them come, and our people is wise enough to decide. And actually, maybe Indonesia would be a country that would welcome Australia beef that the US said that they don't want to receive anymore. So I think having alternative trade partners is something that the region are looking at the moment.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of similarities there in what you're saying about how the region is trying to deal with this as a region, but also in how it's working with outside partners. So I'm going now to the Honourable Lisa Singh, former Senator and CEO of the Australia-India Institute, to give a sense of the Indian Ocean impact and, of course, its biggest economy, India.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's wonderful to join such an esteemed group of panelists that have already contributed so much to the complexity that the region is facing. Particularly Joel's focus on the Pacific, I think very much mirrors what is occurring in the Indian Ocean. That was also just shared by Dr. Fitriani. I think really when Richard talks about the fact that this is a transformational era, there is no doubt that we have already been in that space for a while in terms of global diplomacy and security in this Indian Ocean region. But now to have global trade feature so prominently in the region as part of that transformational approach is really quite devastating for the region. And of course, it's not just about the geopolitical tensions that the Indian Ocean region or regional conflicts have already been facing. I think the fact that you combine the convergence of that now with countries in the region almost sort of having to be in a position of choosing between economic nationalism and economic pragmatism is going to make it very difficult for certain developing nations to navigate, including, of course, the way Australia continues its relationships with those particular nations. And I wanted to just sort of focus on a few in the Indian Ocean region. Obviously, India, a country that was straight out of the blocks with President Maude visiting, President Trump, in his first sort of times in office this year, didn't have any sort of potential to alleviate the shockwaves that all of the countries in the Indian Ocean region have faced when it comes to the tariffs that have been dealt. In fact, India was got hit with 26% tariffs. Even if you look at other South Asian countries such as Bangladesh, 37%, Sri Lanka, 44%. All of these obviously are numbers which we know now are now in a 90-day sort of holding pattern, but that unreliability of the future is still there. I think so, though, this is not just about the numbers when we look at the impact of the tariffs on the Indian Ocean region. It's about trust. It's about long-standing relationships being upended. And India and Indonesia, obviously being very large economies in the Indian Ocean region, also, though, do have quite diversified export bases. And I think that is where potentially they have some internal resilience and capacity to adjust should these tariffs continue beyond the post-freeze. But I think it goes without saying that the volatility of the current geopolitical climate can be really deeply damaging to the domestic economies in the Indian Ocean should Trump continue his mission to reset the global trade system. Particularly also for some other Indian Ocean countries. In countries like Sri Lanka, they're already facing a quite fragile post-crisis recovery. It's not just about trade, it's about a potential humanitarian issue. Similarly for Bangladesh, it's a country that has built its growth story around labour-intensive exports like garments. Tariffs really threaten the livelihoods on a mass scale, particularly of women. In the workforce in Bangladesh, women workers who are in that export industry. So, of course, all of this is happening at a time when the region is still recovering from the aftershocks of the COVID pandemic, from all sorts of supply chain disruptions that happened through that process, on top of climate change pressures that the region faces, rising food and energy costs, all of it adding to now this economic squeeze as another critical factor, let alone the recent halt on USAID development assistance that several countries in this region have faced. So the combined effect is a dangerous double bind. It's, obviously the punitive tariffs on exports from the United States, but also the reduced development assistance. I think our own Prime Minister Albanese last week, I think he said in a press conference that these tariffs fly in the face of economic logic. I think that is very true. It is very hard to understand where this is going and how it is good for anyone or any one country. I think the bottom line is, though, for all of us living in the Indian Ocean region, is that we are just seeing an erosion of reliability. And that erosion of reliability is what is leading to us needing to really reset how we see our relationships with each other. I think a bit of what Bill said about multilateralism, there's a lot of multilateral institutions in the Indian Ocean region that Australia could really start to build its support with, ASEAN being obviously one of those. I think it really is, though, a crossroads for Australia in terms of where it finds itself. And I think it is also an opportunity, though, for us to really, recognising, I think, as C. Rajamohan said, that Trump has shredded the old mats of globalisation, and we've all got this uncharted, waters ahead of us. It's also a time where countries like Australia and India have already built quite a strong, trusted relationship in terms of security, and now economically, we can start to see ourselves wanting to do that a lot more closer in this new wave of reform that we just don't know where the storm is going to weather.
Well, and I think, Lisa, you've started us on what we want to look at next, which is what can Australia do? This is the situation we're in, and I think everyone's given a great sense of that. We now want to turn much more to, well, what's Australia's response? What should our role be? Our role in the region, and in particular, what are suggestions to the next government? So I am going to go back to you, Lisa, on that, thinking if you were in the next government and all the people you know so well, what would you be doing? Before I go to you, I'll just mention that we're getting some great comments in. So thanks to Armin Hicks, Matthew Keane, Chris Cathiravel, Nick McClellan, Susan Engel. Please keep those coming. Our speakers may also want to type responses to some of those, because there's going to be so many wonderful views, we won't get to them all. So back to you, Lisa, on the what do we do about it with the resources that we have as Australia.
Thanks, Melissa. I think at the regional level, Australia's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region has really been building itself up a lot stronger, which puts us in a good position. But I think that our engagement can no longer be built solely on sort of external partnerships, particularly those that engage with the United States. I think we have to be a lot more anchored in internal resilience. We need to think about our domestic industries, our local capacity. We have had, in a sense, an over-dependence, particularly in a security sense, on one particular single partner. And I think going forward, whilst we may be in a better position than many other countries because of our close ties that we've built with countries in our region, particularly like Indonesia and India, against the backdrop that we find ourselves in, the question for Australia is really not just how now we respond to this in terms of the United States change of, sort of almost ripping up the liberal rules-based order, but how we lead in this. And I think Australia's approach to regional engagement, it has been grounded on the stability of globalisation, the reliance on free trade, a rules-based international order, which was largely backed by the United States, who set that order. So with that change, I think we do need to adapt, and I think resilience at home should be a strong part of that. Self-reliance obviously goes hand in hand with that, as well as increasing our relevance in our region to becoming a closer regional partner, an advocate for free and fair trade practices at all of the various multilateral and unilateral forums that we can participate in.
Fantastic. Well, I'll go straight to Fitri. Does Southeast Asia want Australia to lead? If so, how?
Thanks for the question. I think Australia already is a dialogue partner for ASEAN since 1974. And I think there's a lot of history there. Of course, it's a big ask for the region to ask Australia to step in the absence of the US. But in missing to do so, we actually already seeing how China and Russia trying to fill in the gap. And through our identification of information influence in the region, there's already news on how the US is no longer able to hold its back. America, the era of the US is over. Now let's see and build our south to south cooperation through BRICS and all. So can Australia work on this? Yes, of course. Of course, as Honorable Singh mentioned, Australia lead in norm building in the cyberspace, and ideally in the subsea cable. And what we see recently is how China is looking at the under the sea mining as well as something that we haven't chartered the norms and rules yet, especially when there's UNCLOS, but we know that the US is not actually abiding by UNCLOS. And if the US go unilateral and allowing that to happen, subsea mining, and perhaps China would say, yeah, we're going to do that too. And the recent agreement and concern and conflict in South China Sea as well, it's something that perhaps Australia can see and perhaps work together. Now, I saw the question from Nick, I think, that asking whether it's time for Australia to abandon the treaty on the abolition of nuclear weapons. And I want to say that so far, when Australia actually having the diplomatic engagement with Indonesia as well as country in the region, the nuclear-powered submarine is not carrying nuclear weapons. So it's not considered as nuclear weapons yet. But I don't know whether that situation changed. So we advise for Australia, if wanted to still be accepted in the region in terms of diplomacy as well, please don't abandon non-proliferation treaty as well. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. And that norm building in all sorts of areas, including in cyber, continuing in disarmament. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to Joel on the same question. What would you like Australia to be doing at this moment of transformation?
I mean, I think to just continue on with my earlier theme of Pacific regional integration. I mean, I think like Dr. Fitriani and the Honourable Lisa, Australia is already doing a lot in the Pacific. It's the major donor. It is a trusted member of the Pacific Islands Forum. It's a founding member of the forum. But I think, again, at this time of sort of instability and turbulence, Australia is also doing things that could be seen as early steps or parts of regional integration, and particularly a form of regional integration that is sort of centered around Australia. And I think that would be a trend well worth continuing by the next Australian government. Of course, when you think about economic integration and when you think about things like labour and skills migration. Australia has a long established program of labour mobility. It's established even arrangements around the freer movement of people. The Pacific Engagement Visa is a good example of that in Australia. When you think about security integration, Australia has undertaken to sign a number of agreements with countries like Tuvalu and also Nauru and Papua New Guinea that really start to, I think, build out a regional security sort of architecture with Australia really at the centre of that. But I think in saying all of that, and if there were to be a future where we were a more integrated region, with Australia really being somewhere central to that, then the building out of that really requires Australia to do the right things and to play the right way by the Pacific. At this time in history, I don't think it's a good time for Australia to be transactional in its relationships with the Pacific. I think it has to sort of demonstrate genuineness. It has to draw on its people and cultural ties to the region even more than it has done in the past. And I think just to respond to Nick's question, I think an important part of that is to recognize that, you know, the nuclear legacy issue in the Pacific is a challenging one. That's why many Pacific Island countries have signed on to non-proliferation treaties. That's why the Pacific has its own South Pacific Nuclear Free Treaty. And if as part of that sort of a genuine, you know, reflection of Pacific interests, Australia would do well to think carefully about its own nuclear future vis-a-vis its relationship to the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think we've covered some of these themes around norms and norm building already. Bill, what would you like to add for what Australia should be doing?
Well, I think we need to be very hard-headed about the United States and the future of the relationship. No one in the political elite, obviously, is going to risk saying too much about this before the 3rd of May. But once the election is out of the way, I think it's time for a fairly dramatic rethink of how we relate to the United States, not least because if a perception persists that we're a little Suryako for Washington, that will compromise our capacity to build up relations beyond a certain point with the other states that Hayley mentioned in her list, which I think is a very useful starting point for broadening our relationship. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that the dysfunctionality within the policy process in the United States at the moment is palpable, obviously with the imposition of tariffs on an island predominantly populated by penguins, but also because of the deeper problem of attempts that are being made at the moment to interfere with the running of elections at state level in the United States. That's been going on for a while now and does create a situation in which even if a Democrat candidate wins the popular count at the 1928 presidential election, that candidate won't necessarily win the election. And we should remember the comment once made by President Somoza of Nicaragua, who said, "You won the election, but I won the count." And that's a problem that's looming at the moment. Owen Harries once said, if you act as if you can be taken for granted, you will be taken for granted. And now more than ever, I think it's an opportune moment for us to keep that particular warning prominently in mind.
Thank you. And Hayley.
Thanks, Melissa. Can I just riff off something that Bill said as well? I completely agree with him that after the election, the Australian government needs to re-explain the Australia-US relationship. Actually, the whole purpose of the US Studies Centre when it was set up almost 20 years ago was to help Australians understand America. And I think one of the best things that the new government will be able to do is reset the relationship so that we work more with the states. Think about California, for instance. It's bigger than, it's bigger than some countries. Yeah. And its economy is all about clean energy, for instance. Like there's lots that Australia can do at their sub-state level. So I think that we should really focus on that. And then in terms of what Australia should do more broadly, I've already mentioned working with other countries. I'll mention two other quick things. One is that I think we need to get better at talking out of both sides of our mouth. What do I mean by that? I mean that on the one hand, we need to talk about free trade and a free global order. And on the other hand, we need to still work with countries that are being difficult. The United States, China, other countries in our region that are being difficult. You know, that saying that with China, we need to disagree where we must and cooperate where we can. I think that should be applied to the United States as well. Basically, these relationships are more complex, and we need to do a better job of you know, supporting the WTO and free trade agreements, as well as working with these other countries, because there's still lots to get out of these countries and get the best outcome for Australia. And the last thing that I'll say, it hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's really important. It's at the core of all of what we're talking about. And that is building Australian resilience through a more sophisticated conversation with the Australian public. What does that look like? It looks like sharing more information with the private sector, with business and with academia about the threats and challenges and the changed geopolitical environment. And it also is a tough conversation that cost of living and other things are going to get worse, and that we need to be grateful for what we have now, but appreciate that with all what's happening in the global trading system and with relationships between states, things will get tougher, things will get more expensive. I don't want it to be a doom and gloom thing, but if you don't be frank and honest with the Australian public, they won't be as resilient, they won't be as prepared to counter those threats personally and to be mentally prepared for the next couple of decades.
And that's where all the 1930s analogies we've been talking about today come in. You need a population that's ready for difficult times. Part of that, I'd say, Hayley, is also making people feel they have agency in this. Sometimes when we look at what's happening around the world, we can feel quite disempowered by it. And I thought I might end just by asking each of you something that you're actually doing about this, whether it's a dialogue, something you're writing about, something you're researching, that you think is trying to actually deal with this moment of turbulence and try and turn it into transformation. So I'll stick with you, Hayley, if I can, and then go back. So what's something you're doing to try to deal with this time?
I am talking to the private sector about what would make them invest in critical minerals and rare earths, because they're mined in such tiny quantities that there's no commercial value in them, but China dominates the global supply of critical minerals, which go into new technologies, clean energy, defense technology. And so if you can't convince the private sector to invest in new mines and processing, we will never create new supply chains. So that's what I'm doing.
Got it. Brilliant. Bill, what are you doing? Anyone you're talking to, anything you're researching?
Well, yes, I'm keeping an eye out for academic positions in Australia to draw to the attention of friends in America who've either lost their jobs at the US Institute of Peace or the Woodrow Wilson Centre for Scholars, or who are looking to exit in the way that scientists left Germany in the 1930s for greener pastures. Because I do think there is a great opportunity for countries like Australia to secure the services of outstanding academics who are looking around at the moment, and to my personal knowledge, taking down their Facebook pages for fear that they might get them into trouble with the authorities in the United States.
We can be a safe haven and we can benefit from the global talent. Joel?
I'm working with a colleague on just trying to articulate what a specific rules-based order might look like. Basically, we're trying to sort of take all of the normative statements, declarations, even treaties, and see how we can sort of consolidate them so that they look a bit more like a coherent set of rules articulating the Pacific's interests. We hope that will help to put the Pacific in good stead in these times. Thank you.
Thank you. Fitriani.
Thanks, Melissa. At ASPE, I'm heading a project of hybrid threats in Indo-Pacific pilot action. We're looking at how the region, both Southeast Asia and the Pacific, is ready and have the awareness of detecting and addressing hybrid threats, mostly from authoritarian countries, but hopefully build capacity there as well.
Brilliant. And Lisa?
Well, the Institute just launched a 10-year roadmap for the future of the Australia-India defence and security relationship. One of the pieces out of that in addressing the times that we currently face and the threat of multilateralism by the United States, or at least its withdrawal from various multilateral institutions, is focusing on the importance of trilaterals. So we will host a dialogue with Indonesia and India, looking particularly at security, so maritime security in particularly the Indian Ocean, and how we can now look at that through the lens of the withdrawal potentially of the United States being active in the region we live in, and therefore the importance of large economies, growing economies like Indonesia and India, playing a stronger role with Australia, whether it's in defence industry space or in defence activities itself in the region.
Brilliant. Thank you. And for all of you, thank you for your time. For everyone who's joined us today, thank you for being part of the discussion, for not putting your head under the pillow and giving up, but thinking about what this time means, but also what we can do about it. And I've taken so much away from today. Now, this is the second in our series. We have one more of these election webinars, which will be looking at global insecurity and what that means for Australia. So please do follow the link in the chat. If you don't already follow us on socials, you can follow there. And please do stay in touch and be part of these debates. Thank you again to everyone who's joined us. I'm sorry I went a tiny bit over, but I had a fantastic time hearing from all of our panellists today. Thank you again.